An elderly woman of color humiliated at the bank. Luckily, Jason Carter was there. Some stories begin in the most ordinary places on a regular day, yet they end up revealing the deepest truths about human nature. That was exactly what happened one late afternoon at the Grand Horizon Bank on Madison Avenue in New York City. The bank was crowded with long lines stretching from the service counters to the entrance. Customers shifted impatiently, checking their watches and muttering frustrated complaints under their breath. The air was thick with tension. Tension filled the air as employees rushed back and forth, struggling to keep up with the chaos behind the counter. At one of the service stations, Amanda Brooks, a young bank teller with tired eyes and an impatient demeanor, typed away at her computer. She had been in this job long enough to know which customers mattered and which ones didn't, or at least that's how she saw it. And in her mind, the elderly woman standing in front of her wasn't someone worth much attention. Margaret Dawson, a 73-year-old retired school teacher, stood quietly, clutching an envelope in her slightly trembling hands. Margaret had always been independent, never one to ask for favors or handouts. But today she had come seeking answers. She had noticed unexpected fees deducted from her account, small amounts, but enough to make a difference in her already tight monthly budget. Living on a fixed pension, every dollar mattered. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, trying to keep her voice steady. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "I believe there's been a mistake in my account. I've been charged fees I wasn't informed about." Amanda barely looked up from her screen. Fingers still tapping at her keyboard, Amanda responded flatly, "Those are standard account maintenance fees, ma'am." Margaret hesitated, holding out her receipt. "But I've had this account for years, and I've never been charged these fees before." Amanda sighed dramatically, finally glancing up with clear annoyance. Snatching the envelope from Margaret's hands, she flipped through the papers half-heartedly before shoving them back toward her. "It's in the fine print of your agreement. If you didn't read it, that's not our fault." Margaret blinked, taken aback. Amanda rolled her eyes, the gesture exaggerated enough that a few people in line chuckled quietly. Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. "Look," Amanda continued with an overly dramatic sigh, "if you want to avoid fees, you need to keep more money in your account. That's how banks work, ma'am." The public humiliation had begun. Margaret's throat tightened. She wasn't trying to argue, she just wanted fairness. She had been a loyal customer for decades, yet in this moment, that seemed to count for nothing. As she glanced around, she realized that no one was willing to meet her eyes. The same strangers who had been loudly complaining about the slow service just moments ago had suddenly fallen silent. The same people who had been complaining about their own long wait times were now suddenly indifferent to her struggle. "I just want to understand what happened," Margaret said, her voice quieter but still clinging to hope. At that moment, Carl Jensen, the branch manager, approached. He had been watching the exchange from a distance, arms crossed, as if weighing whether this situation was worth his time. Carl was a man who believed that time was money, and in his mind, Margaret Dawson wasn't worth much of either. He cleared his throat and looked down at her with a thin, practiced smile. "Is there a problem here?" Carl asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't expecting an answer. Amanda immediately straightened her posture. "No, sir," she said quickly, her voice snapping into place as if she were reporting to a superior officer. "Just a customer who doesn't understand our policies." Carl turned to Margaret, his polite smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Ma'am, we have standard fees in place. If you can't maintain the minimum balance, there's nothing we can do." Margaret squared her shoulders, gathering every ounce of dignity she had left. "I've always kept my account in good standing," she said firmly. "These fees just started appearing. All I'm asking is for someone to review them," Margaret said firmly. Carl let out a short, amused chuckle. "What's in the system is in the system, ma'am. We don't review automated charges." Then came the final blow. Carl leaned slightly over the counter, and in a voice loud enough for the entire bank to hear, he said, "If you can't afford the fees, maybe this bank isn't the right place for you." A sharp silence filled the room. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. Her fingers tightened around the envelope she had brought with her. Margaret had never felt so small. Then, a deep, steady voice cut through the air. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The entire bank fell silent. Heads turned toward the entrance. A man in a black t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap stood there. At first glance, he looked like any ordinary customer, but there was something about him, his posture, his voice, his presence that made people straighten up. Carl turned slowly, irritation flashing across his face. "And who are you to question how we handle our customers?" The man took a few steps forward, pulling off his cap. Gasps rippled through the room. Jason Carter? Yes, that Jason Carter, the action star, the legend, the man who had played some of the toughest, most fearless characters on screen. And now, he was standing in the middle of the bank, staring Carl Jensen down. Carl's confident stance faltered. "Mr. Carter, Jason raised a hand slightly, cutting him off. His voice was calm, but firm. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said. "What matters is why you're treating this woman like this." Margaret turned to Jason, eyes wide with disbelief. Carl cleared his throat, scrambling to regain control. "Sir, this is none of your business. We have policies in place, and this lady doesn't meet the requirements." Jason tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, knowing smile, he asked, "Policies? Or just an excuse to humiliate someone who's simply asking for fairness?" A few customers murmured in agreement. Amanda, who had seemed so confident earlier, now glanced nervously at Carl, waiting for him to fix the situation. Jason turned back to Margaret, his voice gentler now. "Ma'am, what exactly is the problem?" "Can you show me what's going on?" Jason asked. Margaret hesitated for a moment before handing him the envelope. He took it carefully, scanning the documents inside. After a few seconds, he looked up at Carl, his expression unchanged. "This is a mistake," Jason said plainly. "These charges shouldn't be here. You're going to fix this." Carl opened his mouth, but Jason raised a hand again, stopping him. "If it's a mistake, you'll fix it," Jason continued, his voice steady. "And if it's not," his voice dropped slightly, becoming even more controlled, "then it's going to be a problem. A much bigger problem for you," Jason added. Carl's face paled. Amanda fidgeted nervously. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Carl shifted his weight, glancing at Amanda as if silently asking for a way out. But she had no answers. Jason crossed his arms, standing firm, waiting for a response. And for the first time that day, Carl Jensen looked truly nervous. The bank manager had spent years perfecting the art of dismissing customers like Margaret Dawson. But this time, he couldn't. Carl had spent years dismissing customers who, in his mind, were too old or too poor to matter. But he had never expected someone like Jason Carter to step in and challenge him. The weight of the entire room was on him now. Customers who had once ignored Margaret's struggle were suddenly paying attention, their eyes darting between the Hollywood star and the man in the stiff suit. Jason's voice was steady, controlled. "This isn't about policies, it's about respect." He turned to Margaret, his expression softening. "Ma'am, you said these fees weren't here before?" Margaret nodded slowly, still in disbelief that any of this was happening. Margaret still couldn't believe this was even happening. "I've had this account for over 30 years. I've never seen these charges before. They just appeared 2 months ago." Jason turned his attention back to Carl, raising an eyebrow. 2 months ago? So tell me, why did the maintenance fees on her account suddenly triple?" His tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it that made Carl's throat tighten. Carl forced a small chuckle, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Carter, I don't think you understand how banking works," he said, his voice carrying a forced politeness. "Fees are adjusted based on policies set at the corporate level. If she doesn't meet the requirements for a premium account, she incurs charges. That's how it's structured," Carl explained, his tone slightly defensive. Jason nodded slowly, pretending to consider the explanation. "Right. But tell me, Carl, do you review those charges? Do you actually check if they're correct? Or do you just assume the system is always right?" Carl hesitated. He knew he was walking into a trap, but there was no easy way out. "The system is designed to be accurate," he said cautiously. Jason let out a short breath through his nose, an almost amused sound. "So, you don't check?" He glanced down. Jason glanced down at the papers Margaret had given him, flipping through them quickly. "Here's what I see, Carl," he said, his voice measured but firm. "A woman who's been banking here for decades suddenly gets hit with fees she wasn't informed about. When she asks for clarification, she's mocked and humiliated. And now, you're standing here trying to tell me it's just policy?" Carl's face turned red. His fingers tapped against his forearm, a nervous habit. We follow guidelines. We don't make exceptions," he stammered. Jason's expression hardened. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "You do make exceptions, just not for people like her. For people like Margaret," Jason continued. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the entire bank, making Carl feel as though the walls were closing in on him. Amanda, the young teller, cleared her throat, looking even more nervous. "Mr. Jensen, maybe we should just..." Carl shot her a glare that made her mouth snap shut. He was losing control, and he knew it. Jason, however, was just getting started. He turned toward the watching crowd. "How many of you have had unexpected fees show up on your accounts in the last few months?" He held Margaret's papers up like evidence in a trial. At first, there was silence. Then, a few hesitant hands went up. A middle-aged man in a work uniform, a young woman holding a baby, an elderly couple near the back. More hands followed. Carl's stomach dropped. This was bigger than just Margaret. Jason nodded slowly, scanning the room. "So, it's not just her. Interesting." He turned back to Carl. "You might want to think carefully about your next words." Carl swallowed hard. He was trapped. If he kept dismissing Margaret, he'd be dismissing half the people in the room. If he admitted fault, his career could be on the line. Carl's career could be on the line. But Jason didn't give him time to think. "Let's check something," he said, motioning toward the computer behind the counter. "Since you're so sure the system is accurate, go ahead. Pull up her account. Let's see those fees." Carl hesitated. Jason tilted his head slightly. "What's wrong? I thought you said everything was clear. For people who pay attention." Amanda's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Carl shot her a sharp look, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. She had no choice. With shaky hands, she pulled up Margaret's account. The screen loaded. The numbers appeared in sharp contrast against the glow of the monitor. Jason leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the information. A slow smile crossed his face. "Well, look at that." He tapped the screen lightly. The fees started 2 months ago, right after a change in bank policy. And not just on her account. He turned back toward the watching customers. "How many of you have been banking here for more than 5 years?" Several hands shot up. Jason's smile didn't fade. "And how many of you started seeing new charges around the same time?" More hands went up. The bank was silent. The bank was completely silent, except for the sound of someone shifting uncomfortably near the back. Jason turned back to Carl. "You see where I'm going with this?" Carl's face was ashen now. "Mr. Carter, I assure you we don't target specific people." Jason held up a hand, cutting him off. "You don't?" He let the words hang in the air. "Funny, because based on what I'm seeing, the majority of these new fees are hitting elderly customers, people who are less likely to challenge them, people who might not have the energy to fight back." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That's not policy, Carl. That's a scam." Carl opened his mouth, then closed it again. His pulse was hammering in his ears. Jason took a step forward, his voice lowering. "I don't like bullies, Carl. And I really don't like people who take advantage of the ones who deserve the most respect." He motioned toward Margaret. "This woman dedicated her life to teaching. She shaped minds. And you're telling me she doesn't deserve basic decency?" Carl was sweating now. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. The customers were watching, the employees were watching, and worst of all, someone was recording. Carl spotted a young man near the front of the line, holding up his phone, filming the entire thing. Jason followed Carl's gaze and let out a low chuckle. "Yeah, that's right. This is going out there." He turned back to Carl, his voice steady. "So, here's what you're going to do. You're going to reverse every single one of those charges. Not just for Margaret, but for every customer affected. And then, you're going to apologize. Properly." Carl's jaw clenched. His career was flashing before his eyes. Jason stepped even closer. "And if you don't..." He let the question hang in the air. Jason let the question hang in the air before shaking his head. "Well, let's just say I'd be really interested to see how corporate reacts when they find out their branch manager made headlines for defrauding elderly customers." Carl exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping. He turned to Amanda. "Fix it," he muttered. Amanda wasted no time. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, reversing every charge. The tension in the bank began to shift. The nervous whispers turned into quiet murmurs of approval. Jason watched as the numbers changed on the screen. He turned back to Jason, turned to Margaret, offering her a small nod. "That's more like it." Carl's face was pure defeat. But Jason wasn't done. "Now," he said, folding his arms, "let's hear that apology." Carl clenched his jaw. He swallowed hard. "Mrs. Dawson, I apologize for the misunderstanding." Jason raised an eyebrow. Carl sighed. "I apologize for the way you were treated. It was unacceptable." Margaret didn't say anything for a moment. Then slowly, she nodded. "Thank you." Jason glanced around, making sure everyone had seen it. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" he said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Turning toward the customers, he continued. Let this be a lesson," Jason said, his voice firm yet steady. "Speak up, stand up, and don't let anyone make you feel like you don't matter." For the first time that day, the room filled with something other than tension. It filled with quiet admiration. And just like that, Jason Carter turned, put his cap back on, and walked out of the bank. But the story wasn't over yet. The video would go viral, and the consequences for Carl Jensen were just beginning. The moment Jason stepped out of the bank, the atmosphere inside shifted. The customers who had initially remained passive now exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Something had changed. Murmurs of approval spread through the room, while the employees behind the counter, including Amanda Brooks, struggled to process what had just happened. Carl Jensen, the once confident bank manager, stood frozen. His face was pale, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. Worse, the young man near the front of the line was still recording. Carl's heart pounded as he turned sharply toward Amanda. "Shut that down, now!" Amanda hesitated, glancing between him and the computer screen, where the reversed fees were still displayed. "Sir," Carl clenched his jaw, but it was too late. The young man filming, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "Already uploaded, buddy. You can't erase this." Carl's stomach sank. Just moments ago, he had been in complete control, dismissing Margaret Dawson as just another elderly woman who wouldn't fight back. Now, his name and face were about to be all over the internet. Margaret, standing beside the counter, watched the scene unfold with a quiet but growing sense of satisfaction. For the first time since stepping foot in the bank, for the first time since stepping into the bank that afternoon, Margaret didn't feel small. She had spent her entire life teaching her students to stand up for what was right. But she had never imagined that someone like Jason Carter would step in and remind her of that lesson when she needed it most. The young man with the phone grinned. "Man, this is going to blow up. People are going to love seeing you get put in your place." Carl's pulse thundered in his ears. He grabbed his suit jacket and turned sharply, heading straight for his office. He needed damage control. And he needed it fast. But before he could disappear behind his office door, Amanda spoke up. Her voice was hesitant but clear. "Sir, I think we should report this." Carl froze. Amanda continued, her tone steadier now. "We were never supposed to charge those fees in the first place. If corporate sees this..." Carl whirled around, his face now bright red. "You think corporate is going to back some old woman over me?" He let out a bitter laugh, though the nervous edge in his voice betrayed him. "I've been running this branch for 8 years. The sound of a notification alert interrupted him. One phone chimed, then another, and another. Across the bank, notifications went off as customers checked their screens. Margaret, confused, glanced at the young man still holding up his phone. He smirked. "Told you, the video's already spreading." Carl snatched his own phone from his pocket, his fingers fumbling, his breath caught when he saw the screen. The video was live, hundreds of shares already, comments flooding in, his name, his bank, his behavior, all captured in crystal clear 4K. And now, out in the world, a single word escaped his lips. No. The customers in the lobby no longer silent, no longer hesitant, were no longer whispering. Some muttered in agreement, others chuckled under their breath. A few outright shook their heads at Carl in disgust. He could feel the shift, the way the power dynamic had flipped. Minutes ago, Margaret had been the one looking down, ashamed. Now, it was him. Then, the phone rang. Amanda glanced at the caller ID, her eyes widening. "It's corporate." Carl snatched the phone from her hand. Straightening his posture, he cleared his throat before pressing the device to his ear. "Yes, this is Carl Jensen." The voice on the other end was curt, cold. "Mr. Jensen, we need to talk, now." Carl turned on his heel and stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. Outside, the bank settled into an odd silence. The tension was still there, but it had shifted, no longer oppressive, but expectant. Like the moment after a storm, when the damage is being assessed. Margaret exhaled deeply, suddenly aware of how tired she felt. It was over. She glanced around at the other customers, noticing that many still had their phones out, still whispering about what had just happened. Amanda turned toward her. Amanda's posture was less rigid than before. "Mrs. Dawson, I just want to say I'm sorry for how I spoke to you earlier." Margaret studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that." Amanda hesitated, then added, "And I'm really sorry you had to come here to fight for something that should have been yours in the first place." That, Margaret knew, was the real apology. The bank's doors opened, and for a brief moment, a hush fell over the room. Everyone instinctively turned toward the entrance, almost as if expecting Jason Carter to walk back in and finish what he started. But it was just another customer, a woman with 2 children, looking as exhausted as any working mother on a Friday afternoon. Margaret smiled to herself. Jason Carter didn't need to come back. He had already done what he came to do. A few days later, the full impact of that afternoon hit like an earthquake. The video of the confrontation spread faster than anyone had anticipated. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded. And within 24 hours, Grand Horizon Bank's corporate headquarters released an official statement announcing an internal review of the branch's practices. By the end of the week, Carl Jensen was removed from his position. Corporate cited a failure to uphold company values and multiple customer complaints that had suddenly gained traction following the viral video. Amanda was placed under review, but ultimately kept her job after testifying against Carl, admitting that she had been pressured into following unethical instructions. Most importantly, every single customer affected by the unnecessary fees was refunded in full. Margaret watched it all unfold from the comfort of her home. Margaret never thought a simple trip to the bank would turn into something this big, but as she sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and reading the latest headlines about Carl's dismissal, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of victory. And then, one morning, an envelope arrived in the mail. It wasn't from the bank. The postmark read, Los Angeles. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Mrs. Dawson, you didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you. Hope this makes you smile." Jason tucked inside the envelope was a signed Fast and Furious poster and a personalized invitation to one of Jason Carter's upcoming movie premieres. Margaret laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. She set the note down gently, running her fingers over the signature. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt valued. She felt unstoppable. Margaret stood up, stretched, and walked to her front door, feeling lighter than she had in years. The world wasn't perfect, but now she knew. When you fight for what's right, the world wasn't perfect, but now she knew. When you fight for what's right, sometimes the right people show up to fight with you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.